5 days prior, Mike Johnson shared his enthusiasm regarding Jasmine Crockett entering the Senate race. He eagerly rubbed his palms together, flashed a smile for the press, and dubbed her the figurehead of the Democratic Party as though it were a slur. Yesterday evening in Houston, Jasmine Crockett showed precisely how that figurehead appears while wielding hard proof. The events that unfolded subsequently are currently taking the internet by storm. Before you reach the end of this account, the video clips will have twice as many views, memes will have proliferated, and Mike Johnson will remain entirely baffled about how a candidate he ridiculed for 5 consecutive days dismantled his political standing in merely 2 hours. Before we proceed, leave your state in the comments section to find out how many individuals Mike Johnson believes lack everyday American sensibilities. The situation turned intensely personal once CNN scheduled an exclusive town hall event named Face to Face, the Texas Senate race. The general consensus was that the broadcast would center around Jasmine Crockett justifying her political bid. The broadcasting channel had asked Speaker Mike Johnson to provide the conservative viewpoint and detail his amusement over her campaign launch, arguing that Texas voters would never choose her. Johnson agreed right away, having dedicated 5 entire days to ridiculing Crockett in front of any camera lens he could locate. He declared she embodies the modern Democratic Party during Fox News appearances and various press briefings. He repeated the sentiment during corridor conversations while wearing the arrogant smirk that has become his signature look. He informed journalists that he desired for her to possess the biggest and most vocal platform available, struggling to hold back his chuckles. He asserted that voters would send another conservative senator from Texas because it remains a deeply red jurisdiction, filled with sensible citizens who will reject Jasmine's political platform. His staff readied him extensively by reviewing Texas political dynamics, standard conservative arguments, and strategies to portray Crockett as an extreme liberal. His advisors drafted responses for inquiries regarding her legislative stances, her voting history, and her previous remarks concerning Donald Trump. Nevertheless, they failed to ready him for the chance that Crockett would dedicate the night to going on the offensive against him rather than protecting her own record. His handlers completely neglected to prepare him for physical documentation. Jasmine Crockett showed up at the Houston broadcasting facility pulling 3-wheeled luggage cases stuffed with paperwork, printed records, legal briefs, and concrete proof. A CNN coordinator inquired about the contents of her luggage, and Crockett beamed amiably but fiercely while answering with the single-word receipts. The television executive subsequently mentioned to the press that it was the most foreboding solitary word she had encountered throughout 3 decades in broadcasting. Concurrently, Johnson waited inside the green room finalizing his last-minute preparations. He felt at ease and deeply self-assured in his extensive political experience. He adjusted his necktie and rehearsed his line about sensible American citizens, making a mental note to grin and exude the commanding presence of his leadership role. Anderson Cooper hosted the live crowd of 400 individuals, divided equally among conservative and liberal voters. The broadcast lenses were recording as the entire country tuned in to watch. CNN initially projected an audience of 2 million, yet rumors circulated quickly, and the viewership surged past 12 million by 8 o'clock Central Time. Mike Johnson continued to feel self-assured, marking the final moment he would experience that emotion for the foreseeable future. He began with his rehearsed opening, declaring his absolute thrill that Crockett had entered the race since Texans are logical Americans who will utterly reject her propositions. He waved his hands broadly, alleging that she embodies progressive indoctrination and the belief that federal authorities possess more wisdom than local households, religious institutions, and neighborhoods. He pivoted toward the crowd and proclaimed that the people of Texas desire liberty, religious conviction, and representatives who reflect their fundamental beliefs. The conservative portion of the attendees clapped vigorously, and Johnson bowed his head in a polite manner while soaking in their validation. He remarked that she would require a great deal of fortune in her electoral bid, letting his conceited smile stretch widely across his features. Crockett remained entirely motionless with a subtle grin lingering near the edges of her lips, an expression that media analysts would eventually dub the receipt smile. She echoed the words "common sense Americans" at a measured pace, noting aloud that she appreciated the terminology. She proposed that they delve into the topic of logical thinking and unlatched her initial carrying case with an intentional snapping sound. Logic dictates that anyone making $223,000 annually as the Speaker of the House ought to maintain some form of banking account. She pulled out a record indicating that based on his personal economic declarations submitted under the threat of perjury, he completely lacks one. Johnson's grin wavered slightly as he hastily asserted that the matter had already been clarified. Crockett extracted additional sheets of paper, explaining that she had examined 7 years of his monetary filings spanning from 2016 to 2022, and he failed to list a bank account in any of them. She scattered the paperwork across the desk, highlighting the total absence of any checking, savings, money market, or certificate of deposit balances. An individual pulling in a six-figure income within Congress for multiple years apparently possesses nowhere to store his wealth, judging by his legally binding testimonies. She elevated a different sheet of paper, pointing out that he similarly declares zero assets, no equity shares, no treasury bonds, and zero retirement funds outside of his standard government pension. What you actually hold is somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 in housing debt, alongside supplementary personal loans and a residential equity credit line. Johnson adjusted his posture in his chair as his bravado quickly evaporated, insisting that his monetary arrangements are entirely within the bounds of the law. Crockett inquired about the destination of his income, and the pointed query lingered heavily in the studio atmosphere. She pressed on, observing that as an attorney well-versed in penal defense and economic structures, the math simply fails to compute. She placed the paperwork down meticulously and highlighted that he arrived to school Texans on everyday logic, yet he remains unable to clarify fundamental personal economics to citizens who routinely manage their own checkbooks. Citizens United has submitted a formal ethical grievance regarding his monetary records, labeling them as habitual breaches of national financial transparency mandates. She tilted her body forward, questioning whether he felt absolutely delighted to detail the exact whereabouts of his cash, especially since she has remained completely forthright regarding her own wealth. She smirked and inquired about when he might reciprocate that transparency, mentioning that currently her only source of delight is observing him struggle to articulate why the third highest-ranking official in the nation cannot locate a banking institution. The liberal segment of the crowd exploded into thunderous clapping, and multiple individuals rose to their feet. Johnson's complexion drained of all color, given that his public relations coaching had utterly failed to brace him for a forensic accounting review. If you maintain a banking balance and earn under $200,000 annually, type the phrase "common sense" in the comments section to reveal how many viewers operate with greater economic transparency than the House Speaker. Johnson tried to regain his footing, declaring that he had not attended the event to debate his private checkbook, but instead to expose Crockett's extremist political platform. He proclaimed himself a constitutional attorney who thoroughly comprehends legal statutes and the explicit text of the Constitution. Crockett cut him off, pointing out his signature on a legal brief begging the Supreme Court to discard the ballots of millions of citizens, an effort that was dismissed in a unanimous 9-0 decision. He defended his actions by arguing that it represented a valid judicial inquiry concerning standard electoral protocols. Crockett dug into her luggage and recited the exact words of the Supreme Court, quoting that Texas failed to display a legally recognizable stake in the manner by which a separate state operates its voting systems. She raised her eyes, stressing that absolutely no justice deemed his rationale worthy of deliberation, not excluding the jurists nominated by Donald Trump. Every last member of the highest court evaluated his judicial logic and firmly rejected it. Johnson clenched his jawline, insisting that the judicial panel opted against taking the lawsuit strictly due to procedural technicalities. Crockett fired back immediately, stating that the bench refused to entertain the matter simply because his legal foundation was utter rubbish. She noted that he pressured more than 125 peers to endorse the document, risking his professional standing on a judicial hypothesis so flimsy that it suffered a unanimous defeat. She tossed her head in disbelief, remarking that he wishes to challenge her credentials despite failing to persuade even one Supreme Court justice to agree with him on the defining legal battle of his professional life. Anderson Cooper fought visibly to uphold his objective journalistic demeanor. Crockett pressed forward, observing that the document was submitted on the 10th of December in 2020 CC, barely a month prior to the events of January 6th, during a period when he was convincing millions that the presidential race was rigged. You repeatedly assured millions of citizens that the election was purloined, leveraging the prestige of your law credential and congressional seat, and subsequently feigned shock when the public took your word for it. She took a brief pause to articulate that basic logic dictates that if an individual assists in propagating a falsehood, they bear the blame when the masses take action based upon it. If you have successfully won a single debate in your life, you possess better qualifications than the speaker's track record before the highest court, so type the word unanimous in the chat section. Johnson began to perspire heavily and subtly adjusted his necktie, an anxious movement that social media users would ridicule for weeks to come. He attempted to change the subject toward his background championing religious freedoms and shielding traditional morals from excessive federal interference. Crockett sliced right through his deflection, highlighting that he committed 8 full years of his life to the alliance defending freedom. She questioned whether he was aware of the specific label the Southern Poverty Law Center assigns to that particular entity. Johnson's expression turned rigid as he declared that the SPLC functions as a partisan liberal group that has completely lost its credibility. Crockett refused to let him complete his thought, mentioning that watchdogs classify the outfit as a hate group, and he served them as an in-house lawyer and public representative. He advocated for them inside courtrooms and actively participated in designing their judicial battle plans. She pulled out a fresh pile of paperwork, detailing how the ADF campaigned to maintain criminal penalties for homosexuality while fighting against anti-harassment initiatives within educational institutions. The organization advocated for conversion treatments and legally argued that transgender individuals do not deserve statutory civil rights safeguards. She located a precise document and recited text from a judicial brief he had authored regarding the landmark Lawrence versus Texas case. Your specific legal coalition contended that same-sex relationships ought to be categorized in the exact same legal vein as child abuse, multi-partner marriages, and incestuous acts. Those represent the exact parallels you committed to paper and the formal contentions you presented before the highest court in the land. A low wave of whispers cascaded across the crowd, and several conservative attendees appeared visibly distressed. Johnson forced his vocal cords to project, arguing that attorneys merely act as neutral representatives for their paying clientele. Crockett immediately fired back that he was never merely a mercenary lawyer, but rather remained employed there for 8 years precisely because he deeply supported their ideological crusade. She hoisted a separate record, stating that he actively drafted marketing literature and delivered public addresses endorsing their extreme stances. She produced a further sheet of evidence, highlighting that his employer collaborated closely with Exodus International, a controversial therapeutic network that promised to heal homosexual individuals. They interacted with adolescents and instructed homosexual youth that they harbored a core psychological defect requiring a permanent cure. She stopped briefly to emphasize that Exodus International inflicted such severe recorded mental trauma that its very creator eventually disbanded the operation and issued a formal apology. She recited text from her prepared research, quoting Alan Chambers as expressing deep remorse for the anguish and trauma countless people endured, as well as for advancing sexual orientation reversal programs. She shifted her gaze upward toward Johnson, pointing out that Chambers ultimately recognized the damage inflicted and accepted personal accountability. She point-blank asked him if he had ever taken similar steps to make amends. Johnson parted his lips to respond, yet absolutely no sound materialized from his throat. Crockett pushed forward, stating that he devoted 8 long years to asserting that homosexual citizens belonged in prison while simultaneously teaming up with factions attempting to repair gay adolescents. Throughout all the intervening time, she noted that nobody has ever heard him admit fault, validate the resulting trauma, or offer a genuine apology. She slowly moved her head side to side, mentioning that he desperately desires to ridicule her as the primary avatar of the Democratic faction. However, at the very minimum, her likeness is not attached to judicial filings advocating for the incarceration of citizens based solely upon their romantic affections. At the very least, her image remains entirely unlinked to radical coalitions that inflicted psychological ruin upon young people. She consolidated her paperwork into a neat pile and declared that taking responsibility is a core virtue she absorbed growing up in Texas. Whenever an individual causes harm to others, the correct response is to ask for forgiveness. Furthermore, whenever a person is incorrect, they must openly confess their error. If you hold the conviction that all romance is valid and citizens must never face criminal charges for their inherent identities, type the word love down in the comment section. The studio crowd grew incredibly agitated, while Mike Johnson resembled an unsuspecting fellow who strolled into a heavyweight prize fight anticipating a polite intellectual discourse. Crockett changed her tactical approach and adopted a chatty tone, inquiring whether it was accurate that he and his teenage boy track one another's web browsing via an application named Covenant Eyes. Johnson's posture went completely rigid as he desperately argued that the software usage remains a strictly confidential household issue. You intentionally thrust the topic into the public sphere by discussing it during media appearances and elevating it as a moral template for devout Christian households to emulate. She angled her face slightly, pointing out that the highest-ranking legislator in the House relies on a commercial application to surveil his online habits, while funneling that sensitive information to outside data centers. Your designated guardian for moral internet usage is a minor, specifically your own flesh and blood. Johnson's cheeks flushed crimson as he vehemently protested that the current line of questioning was entirely out of bounds. Crockett quickly mentioned that Josh Duggar, a man ultimately found guilty of hoarding illicit exploitation material involving minors, was also a massive public champion for the exact same software. Johnson loudly objected, insisting that the dark connection held no bearing on the current conversation. Crockett's vocal tone grew piercing as she clarified her argument. He essentially confessed to the American public that he lacks the self-discipline to navigate the web unless his teenage boy is actively supervising him. Despite that extreme digital surveillance, when the topic shifts to democratic norms, constitutional guardrails, and verified electoral outcomes, you refuse to answer to a single soul. You circulated blatant falsehoods regarding the 2020 presidential race without facing any consequences, and you assisted in plotting the judicial blueprint that culminated in the events of January 6th without facing a shred of justice. You digitally obscured surveillance video evidence to shield violent insurrectionists from prosecution, entirely escaping any institutional reprimand. She allowed that heavy reality to permeate the room, remarking that while his daily web surfing requires strict oversight, his direct attacks against the bedrock of democracy are somehow perfectly acceptable. If you are capable of browsing the web without your offspring policing your clicks, drop the word adult into the chat to demonstrate just how many viewers possess greater impulse control than the Congressional speaker. Anderson Cooper cast a brief look toward the studio timer, noting they had crossed the midpoint of the broadcast while Mike Johnson had still failed to register a single rhetorical strike. Johnson launched one final desperate bid to reclaim the narrative, sitting bolt upright in his seat and proclaiming that he consistently championed the nonviolent handover of presidential authority. You personally authored the judicial framework that 126 conservative lawmakers utilized in their unified effort to nullify the 2020 national vote. Crockett's speech remained exceptionally steady and analytical as she revealed a bulky portfolio of paperwork detailing the chronological sequence preceding the Capitol riot. She flipped the binder open to the section covering December of 2020, a period when the ballot counting had concluded and Joe Biden was the declared victor. The top law enforcement official appointed by Donald Trump publicly stated that absolutely zero proof of massive voter manipulation existed. You, Representative Mike Johnson, composed a friend of the court petition begging the Supreme Court to erase the legitimate voting outcomes across 4 separate states outside of your personal home district. She elevated the legal petition for everyone to see, explaining that this aggressive scheme to discard millions of valid ballots was hardly an insignificant piece of paperwork. You aggressively campaigned for the initiative and individually persuaded more than 125 of your peers to attach their names to the effort. Johnson desperately tried to interrupt, insisting that the legal submission highlighted valid disputes regarding constitutional law. Crockett immediately silenced him, pointing out that the High Court threw the case out in a 9-0 ruling, and not one single judicial member considered the logic worthy of a hearing. The critical issue at hand remains the timeline of events. You officially submitted the lawsuit less than 30 days prior to the Capitol breach, actively convincing the entire nation that the presidency had been hijacked. The public paid attention and mobilized for action specifically because individuals holding legal credentials and positions of power were bestowing credibility upon a massive falsehood. She produced physical printouts of digital posts dating to January 5th of 2021, displaying instances where he continued to warn citizens that their democratic system was actively being robbed. On the 6th of January in 2021, those rioters arrived in massive droves, invaded the Capitol building, brutally assaulted law enforcement personnel, and constructed a wooden execution structure. She recited statistics from an official report, highlighting that 140 cops sustained bodily harm, Brian Sicknick fell ill and passed away the following afternoon, and 4 additional guards eventually took their own lives. She allowed the heavy quiet to stretch on, before remarking that even following the violent insurrection and the tragic fatalities, he still cast a vote refusing to finalize the Electoral College results. Johnson attempted to break in by insisting he never personally endorsed physical brutality. Crockett pushed forward without pausing, stating that he cast a ballot against forming an investigative commission and subsequently obscured security tapes the moment he assumed the speaker's gavel. She hoisted a frozen image taken from the surveillance tapes featuring obscured identities, emphasizing that he actively masked the features of criminals attempting to topple the American government. Johnson's tone wavered wildly as he argued he distributed the video clips with the faces hidden, to which he retorted that doing so obstructed police efforts to recognize the perpetrators and essentially shielded the violent mob. She placed the printed picture down on the desk and repeated the grim toll. 140 cops suffered wounds, 5 individuals lost their lives, and 4 extra officers ultimately committed suicide. You, the very architect who assisted in manufacturing the grand deception, actively disguised the identities of the assailants, ensuring they could evade legal retribution. Her vocal volume lowered to little more than a quiet murmur as she declared that he ought to feel incredibly thrilled that he is not currently sitting inside a penitentiary. If you retain clear memories of the Capitol attack and the brave guards who protected our republic, punch that exact calendar date into the comment thread below. Johnson appeared utterly shattered, sporting a loosened necktie and prominent perspiration marks seeping through his white fabric collar. The self-assured politician who initially strolled onto the set had vanished completely, substituted by a frantic captive simply tallying the moments until he could flee the room. However, Jasmine Crockett was far from finished with her offensive. A final critical topic remained on the docket for discussion. Johnson's tone barely registered above a faint breath as he weakly protested that his household members ought to remain completely immune from public scrutiny. Crockett responded with a tone that lacked malice but projected sternness, explaining that his spouse injected herself into the public square by operating a commercial psychological advising business. Her official corporate filings explicitly outline her ideological stances regarding which demographics warrant therapeutic care and which segments do not. She presented a concluding pile of paperwork detailing the foundational operating contracts of Kelly Johnson's corporate entity, Onward Christian Counseling Services. She turned to the pertinent section that grouped same-sex attraction right next to animal abuse and incestuous behavior. The live crowd drew a sharp collective breath, and Anderson Cooper's brows shot upward in clear astonishment. The professional therapeutic clinic managed by your spouse formally equated homosexual romance to engaging in intimate acts with livestock. She brandished a separate sheet, pointing out that the specific phrasing utilized within his wife's corporate bylaws perfectly mirrors the text from his own Freedom Guard charitable organization from decades prior. She arranged the twin papers directly next to one another, remarking that it appears almost as though a single author penned both manifestos. Johnson's complexion shifted from a ghostly white to an ashen gray as he desperately pleaded that the explosive phrasing had been removed from its proper surrounding text. Crockett offered to provide that missing background information, observing that shortly after the Huffington Post published an expose regarding the digital homepage, the entire site was dismantled and erased in a matter of hours. She placed the damning evidence onto the desk and questioned why anyone would remove the material if it contained nothing offensive or inappropriate. Why refrain from leaving the webpage active and clarifying the underlying meaning rather than frantically wiping its existence from the global web? Johnson remained entirely speechless and devoid of any rebuttal. You dedicated your professional life to equating homosexual individuals with felons and abusers, and your spouse's commercial venture codified those exact parallels within legally binding paperwork. The moment investigative reporters began posing serious inquiries, the digital proof magically vanished, a maneuver that constitutes a textbook cover-up. Such evasive actions are precisely what culpable individuals execute once they are finally cornered. They destroy the physical traces of their misconduct and pray that the general public remains completely oblivious. She stared at him with an expression bordering on profound sympathy, stating that she certainly paid attention, and currently every single viewer at home has caught on as well. If you firmly believe that equating romantic affection to animal abuse is a moral failure, type the word wrong in the chat box to reveal how many citizens still value basic human respect. Anderson Cooper shot a rapid look toward his off-camera directors, realizing they had exceeded their allotted time slot, yet nobody signaled to cut the live feed. The veteran anchor proposed that the panel conclude the evening with one ultimate back-and-forth dialogue. Crockett signaled her agreement with a nod, sealed her now vacant luggage, and pivoted her body to confront Johnson face-to-face. You initiated this entire spectacle by declaring you were completely thrilled about my Senate campaign, hurling the title of Democratic Party figurehead at me as though it were a vicious slight. You explicitly stated your desire for me to wield the most massive and thunderous broadcasting platform available, and consequently I have arrived. You handed me this exact megaphone, and I intend to utilize it to demand precisely what aspects of my political platform you consider to be so entirely intolerable. Johnson adjusted his posture a fraction, perceiving a fleeting final chance to launch a rhetorical counterattack. He cited extreme liberal strategies that fundamentally clash with traditional Texas ideals, rattling off buzzwords like unprotected borders, Marxist economics, dismantling law enforcement, and progressive cultural indoctrination. Crockett interrupted his list, insisting that he name the exact legislative bills she personally endorses that cross the line into extremism. Johnson paused awkwardly before weakly uttering the word healthcare. Crockett steamrolled ahead, explaining that her actual stance involves driving down medical costs and guaranteeing that ordinary families never face financial ruin simply due to illness. Does that fundamental compassion genuinely qualify as a radical concept? Johnson parted his lips to argue, but Crockett talked right over him, noting her dedication to properly financing state education systems and providing educators with a sustainable income. She advocates for streamlining the ballot access process for all Texas residents and guaranteeing that every single submission is accurately tallied. Johnson attempted to squeeze in a rebuttal, however, Crockett loudly proclaimed that her true platform centers around strict accountability. That principle is precisely what her campaign offers, the supposedly extreme notion that public servants must maintain integrity and transparently report their economic holdings. Government leaders should absolutely not dedicate 8 years of their lives to extremist factions, nor should they assist in orchestrating insurrections or bearing damning documentation. Federal representatives ought not to require their adolescent children to police their daily web browsing habits. She rose to her feet and declared that true radicalism is operating without a standard checking ledger while earning $223,000, all while stubbornly declining to clarify the destination of those funds. It is profoundly extreme to legally advocate for the imprisonment of homosexual citizens, or to rely upon your own male offspring to track your digital footprints. It is incredibly radical to author a judicial blueprint aimed at reversing a Democratic presidential contest and to actively obscure surveillance tapes to shelter violent rioters. I am far from being an extremist, Mr. Speaker. I am simply a black female resident of Texas who refuses to sugarcoat the absolute truth. You remain completely thrilled over my candidacy strictly because you assume that the Texas electorate will never cast ballots for a politician with my background. You believe that local voters will view my presence as a menace, yet they will somehow gaze upon you and recognize a true statesman. She flashed an authentic grin and remarked that she considers Texas citizens far more intelligent than he casually assumes. The voting public easily distinguishes between a representative who battles for their well-being and a politician who champions bigoted organizations and anti-government rebels. Mr. Speaker, following this evening's broadcast, the public has undeniably witnessed a total charlatan. She collected her wheeled luggage cases and expressed mock gratitude for handing her the most expansive and thunderous platform available. She pivoted toward the studio doorway, briefly halted her momentum, and cast one final glance back toward Johnson. The state of Texas is worthy of superior leadership than a speaker incapable of detailing his private treasury or defending his prolonged employment with a radical hate faction. She beamed brightly a final time and mentioned that she requires absolutely zero luck, given that she possesses the undeniable physical evidence. She lingered near the perimeter of the broadcast platform while the liberal demographic of the crowd erupted into a massive upright round of applause. A handful of conservative attendees even joined the clapping, driven by the sheer staggering shock of the absolute dismantling they had just observed. Mike Johnson remained isolated beneath the harsh television bulbs, resembling an utterly defeated figure draped in a wrinkled business suit. His public relations team was presently rushing in his direction, hastily drafting crisis management press releases. The highest-ranking authority figure within the legislature had been completely deconstructed by the very candidate he spent 5 days taunting, leaving him with nobody to fault except his own ego. The sequence of events you just listened to occurred yesterday evening, and the widespread fallout is currently still developing. The video snippets are circulating everywhere, and the specific edit transitioning from his delighted comments to her prison remark has already accumulated 45 million watches. The phrase "Johnson dismantled" is currently dominating social media trends across 42 nations, while "Receipt Smile" is topping the charts in 38. Digital joke images are reproducing at a pace far too rapid for internet analysts to accurately quantify. An anonymous editor compiled a rapid-fire video highlighting every instance Johnson uttered the phrase "absolutely delighted," concluding with Crockett's devastating comeback, an edit that currently boasts 15 million plays. A custom social media lens that digitally smudges the user's facial features beneath the caption requiring an accountability buddy has been applied in excess of 1 million instances. A short audio bite featuring Crockett declaring her possession of the paperwork has officially become the most popular soundbite on the TikTok platform. The Fox News network is fighting desperately to frame the incident as a coordinated left-wing trap, a difficult task considering Crockett utilized Johnson's exact statements and personal filings against him. The nightly program hosted by Sean Hannity completely omitted any reference to the public forum, a glaring silence that reveals the sheer magnitude of the political damage inflicted upon Johnson. The anchor who took over Tucker Carlson's time slot attempted to criticize the aggressive nature of Crockett's delivery, an angle that came across as incredibly pathetic immediately following Johnson's total obliteration. The Wall Street Journal printed a formal opinion piece declaring that the congressional speaker possesses serious inquiries he must now address. The financial donation metrics are absolutely mind-boggling, with Jasmine Crockett's electoral fund pulling in $9.2 million over a mere 14-hour span. The official Act Blue donation portal went offline on 3 separate occasions due to sheer visitor volume, ultimately demanding supplementary digital hosting power. The subsequent consequences will reveal themselves in distinct phases, commencing with the massive internet virality currently taking place. Phase 2 involves the frantic journalistic frenzy that kicked off at dawn and is guaranteed to stretch throughout the entirety of the weekend. The third stage revolves around public survey data, and Johnson's favorability metrics among unaffiliated voters are on the verge of a historic collapse. Phase 4 brings political isolation, as his conservative peers will inevitably begin manufacturing excuses to avoid attending rallies alongside the embattled speaker. Donald Trump has maintained an uncharacteristic silence regarding the ordeal, though he famously harbors zero patience for perceived frailty. Furthermore, the sheer humiliation that transpired yesterday evening was the ultimate display of frailty. Do not feign shock if the former president publishes a message on Truth Social branding Johnson as chronically lethargic or a complete catastrophe. The fifth phase consists of a factional uprising, given that the Freedom Caucus already views Johnson as overly centrist and finally possesses the heavy artillery to strike. The sixth stage guarantees a total career implosion, marked by the rapid evaporation of lucrative publishing contracts and paid oratorical appearances. Come January, Johnson will be battling a formal parliamentary maneuver to strip his leadership gavel, and by the time February rolls around, he will formally declare his retirement from electoral politics. By the arrival of March, Crockett will have transformed this disastrous panel discussion into the foundational pillar of her Senate bid. The official moral inquiry regarding his missing economic records will drastically widen, and relentless press questions will trail him endlessly like a dark specter. The Covenant Eyes Corporation will release a public memo severing ties with the disgraced politician, while the Alliance Defending Freedom will actively delete his identity from their archival documents. Once June arrives, the name Johnson will have evolved into a common slang verb synonymous with being utterly ruined by your own quotes and physical evidence. Jasmine Crockett is poised to secure a massive victory in her upcoming primary race because she displayed the fierce spirit of a Texan brawler who absolutely refuses to retreat. Whether she can capture the general contest this coming November remains considerably more difficult to forecast, considering the state's deeply entrenched political leanings and the formidable nature of incumbent John Cornyn. However, she now campaigns under the banner of the fierce challenger who mathematically dismantled Mike Johnson on nationwide broadcast television, cementing her status as the undisputed queen of paperwork. She serves as living testament that victims can successfully strike back and are under no obligation to silently absorb ridicule or patronizing insults. That specific brand of ferocious political contender is an entity the Lone Star State has truly never witnessed until now. Mike Johnson smugly declared his wish for Jasmine Crockett to secure the most expansive and deafening bullhorn available, and he undeniably achieved that goal. He single-handedly elevated her into a nationwide political sensation and converted a regional election into a country-wide verdict on government transparency. Mike Johnson wasted 5 entire days deriding Jasmine Crockett, weaponizing the title of Democratic Party figurehead as if it were a dirty word. Yesterday evening, within the city limits of Houston, she demonstrated exactly how that specific visage appears once the pleasantries are finally discarded. She gave him a first-hand look at the sheer power of documented evidence. Consequently, the entire public now understands that you never dare to taunt the queen of paperwork unless you are fully prepared to face the documentation yourself, which other arrogant figures out there believe they can simply sneer their way into a political triumph, or remain entirely thrilled regarding a situation they clearly failed to analyze. Leave their specific identities down in the comment section to highlight whoever you believe will be the next unfortunate victim of their own hubris. Forward this message to any resident of Texas who desperately requires a flawless example of what true political accountability resembles. Jasmine Crockett recently verified that everyday citizens who are repeatedly informed they cannot challenge or defeat entrenched elites are entirely mistaken. The preliminary voting phase kicks off in March. The ultimate electoral showdown is scheduled for November. Furthermore, this specific contest is guaranteed to become the most heavily scrutinized senatorial battle across the entire nation. Jasmine Crockett possesses the distinct talent for forcing highly influential individuals to deeply mourn the moment they chose to dismiss her. John Cornyn and Ted Cruz are undoubtedly tuning into the footage right now and furiously scribbling down strategic observations. The reigning champion of documentation is officially campaigning for the upper congressional chamber while heavily armed with hard proof, silently challenging any rival to utter another insult. Mike Johnson is currently hiding away somewhere, desperately attempting to formulate an excuse for how he confidently strolled into that public forum only to crawl out entirely shattered. He is currently lamenting every single syllable he uttered over the previous 5 days, alongside every single arrogant smirk he flashed. He foolishly desired to hand Jasmine Crockett the most gigantic and deafening amplifier on the market, and she efficiently leveraged it to terminate his political viability. Who will be the next unfortunate soul to discover the brutal consequences of failing to respect the power of documented truth?